Chapter 15. Tristan and Nathaniel. Darkrai stood in front of a large lake in the heart of the woods. The remaining residue of mud and dirt smeared across his skin could only do so much to hide the reddening anguish bleeding across his face. His eyes were bloodshot red, his lips tightened, holding back his mixed emotions. The atmosphere was hauntingly quiet. A few birds and doves fluttered in the tree branches above him. A late afternoon fog coasted across the surface of the water. Darkrai stood motionless for a long time, gazing out into nothingness. He took off his coat and stepped into the cool water. The freezing temperatures surged through his body, seizing his muscles tightly. Tears began to form in his eyes, streaking down his muddy cheeks. He stopped walking until the water reached his waist. He looked down and saw his image reflecting back at him through the ghostly fog. He rubbed his neck and saw the red marks left by the roots. He pulled his hands in front of him and saw the same wounds wrapping around his wrists. He dropped his hand, closed his eyes, and slowly sank beneath the lake's surface. The sound around him was dark and dampening. He opened his eyes but could only see a few feet into the murky, dense water. He held his breath until the need for oxygen boiled hotter than his rage. Yet he held himself down. Though the noise was muffled in his ears, he could still hear the voices haunting him, and the images of those voices continued to dance in front of him, no matter how tightly he closed his eyes. His fury boiled. His body jerked for the release of free air, while his soul begged him to stay submerged. A black cloud began to spill around him, permeating the water with a darkening ink, rising to the surface and evaporating above the lake like a dark cloud. A pair of glowing green eyes opened in the dense water. All at once, he shot out of the depths. A geyser of black water and dark, steaming mist broke through the surface like the eruption of a volcano. A monstrous roar erupted from the waves, so loud that the tree limbs began to shake. A pair of paws stroked high in the air and sliced through the tide's layers as a dark creature stood on its hind legs like a horse rearing up against a foe. All at once, the monster smashed its front legs through the water's surface again and into the muddy bank below. The cloud dissolved. Standing in the shallows of the lake was a monstrous, demonic wolf, its face wrinkled with bitter, growling pants while sulfur bellowed out of its nostrils and teeth. He looked up into the heavens, observing the partially revealed moon in the late afternoon sky. He closed his eyes and lowered his head, sinking deeper into his bitterness and wrath. Another cloud began to form around him, even darker than before, mixing and mingling with small flashes of purple in its center. His monstrous growls deepened. His hind legs began to shift and lengthen. Slowly, he began to rise on his hindquarters, almost standing like a man. His spine arched, while his shoulders began to pull backward. "Yes!" he shouted. "Yes!" Suddenly, the dark cloud began to dissolve. "No!" he roared. "No!" He collapsed into the lake, sinking below the surface. Quickly, he gathered his legs beneath him and stood up through the water's surface, gasping for breath. His previous four-legged form resumed. He looked down, seeing his image in the rippling water. A dark, monstrous wolf. It was then the taunting voices returned to his mind, while images of elite figures danced like shadows before his vision. "My prince, Darkrai!" came a voice. The wolf turned his head, spotting one of his soldiers standing on the edge of the bank. "What is it, Spirit Claw?" "She said that we are to take a party with us and follow them," he replied. Darkrai began to walk to the bank. "Is that so?" The Indian stepped aside as his leader stepped out of the bank. "Yes, sir. She said that we are to observe and nothing more." Darkrai shook his body like a wet dog, releasing the water soaked in his fur. "Are we now?" "How many would you like me to take with us, sir?" 8. 8? Wouldn't that possibly increase our chances of being caught? Without warning, Darkrai turned and pounced upon his soldier, pinning him to the ground with a single paw. Spirit Claw quivered beneath his leader's foot, but refused to move an inch. Darkrai lowered the tip of one of his sharp claws to the Indian's neck. "Your answer should have been, 'Yes, sir,' and nothing more." He lowered his snout down to the soldier's nose. Now go fetch me 8 men and return with no less than 8. Spirit Claw swallowed his breath. Yes, sir. Virginia walked cautiously through the dark woods. Her heart began to throb in her neck, and a cold sweat glistened on her face as her eyes darted this way and that into the far corners of the forest. Her eyes turned to every bird rustling leaves on the ground, to every twig snapping in her blind spot. She rubbed her arm with her free hand while her other one held on to Charles's hand. She tried to tame her shaky breaths by drawing in through her nose and out her mouth, but she only continued to shake with each inhale and exhale, while her fears continued to lead her. At that moment, she felt his fingers gently squeeze her hand. She looked up into Charles's eyes. He was smiling down at her. "You're safe." His deep voice splashed over her, slowly melting her shivering fear. She turned her face away, trying to hide the smile growing on her rending face. She looked up into the canopy at the sound of woodpeckers drilling into the trees. Her eyes caught the sight of multiple birds, fluttering from branch to branch, singing to one another. One in particular she recognized. A single dove flew overhead in the distance. He would fly to a branch and nestle there for a few seconds before dashing to another branch, repeating the same task. She stared at it, curiously, as it made its way to them. "Well, hello there," shouted a friendly voice. Virginia dropped her eyes below the dove and saw Tristan walking toward them, carrying a bundle of dead sticks. "You're not setting up camp," he teased. "No, we had another idea in mind," said Charles. The three reached each other and continued talking. "Oh yeah?" said Tristan, stopping in front of them. "What plans are those?" "Well, Virginia here would like to ask you two some questions," said Charles. Tristan smiled. "Is that so?" "Yes, she would like to get to know you both better. I'm sure she has a lot to ask." Tristan turned his face to Virginia. "Becoming a rebel like the rest of us, are we?" Virginia looked into his blindfold. "Can he see me through that?" "A rebel?" Tristan turned his attention back to Charles. "Oh, you didn't tell her, did you?" Virginia looked back and forth between the two of them. "Tell me what? I'm nervous now." Tristan looked back at her. "Only that we are part of the most wanted and hated movement in all of Lathia." Virginia shot a concerned, questioning look at Charles. Charles looked down at her warmly. "Not just us. Other nations and tribes also. And you're quite the spectacle of it all," said Tristan to Virginia. She looked back at Tristan with an even more concerned face. "Hold on," said Charles. "Just tell her about the stuff that is related to you. Let's leave the rest of the bigger issues to Daniel." Virginia looked at Charles. "Daniel?" "Oh, can't I tell her a little bit?" bantered Tristan. "Just the stuff that relates to you," replied Charles. "All right, fine. Here, let me take this kindling back to camp and I'll rejoin you with Nathaniel. That'll give me enough time to think through and filter what I can and cannot say." Charles smiled. "Very good. Where is Nathaniel, by the way?" Tristan walked past them back to camp. "Just keep walking ahead. You'll see him splitting wood. We found a fallen tree that has been dead for some time." "Thank you," shouted Charles. "You're welcome," Tristan called back. Virginia watched Tristan walk through the woods alone, whistling a cheerful tune to himself. She looked up and saw the dove continuing to fly above him from tree branch to tree branch. "That's very interesting," she said. "What is?" inquired Charles. Virginia shook her head. "Nothing. Something I'm going to ask him eventually, I guess." The two of them continued walking. "So, I can't ask any questions about you now, can I?" she teased. "You know my answer to that," he said. She groaned. "Yeah, I know. I just don't know why I can ask them all of these questions and not know more about you. Or me, for that matter." "You will," he said. "I know. When I reach the city of Gala?" Charles smiled. Gaal. "Okay, so it's 2 syllables, with an ah sound at the ending of the first and the beginning of the second?" "That's right." "Okay, so Gaal. That's it. You've got it." "Right, so the city of Charles looked down at her, a humored smile tightening his lips. "Come on, you must have said this word at least once since we've been here." She pushed his shoulder. "Oh, give me a break. It's a hard language, whatever it's called. Yet a very small word. Oh, quit picking on me." He smiled big, no longer able to hold his laughter. His laughter was contagious and spread over to her. She pushed his shoulder again. "Quit it," she laughed. Charles held his hands up, continuing to laugh. "I'm sorry, I can't help it." She opened her mouth, crossed her arms, and looked the other way. You're mean. It's just a simple word, he giggled. 2 syllables. You said so yourself. You've heard me say it maybe 100 times by now. She looked at him playfully. It's still a hard word. Charles raised his hands again, surrendering. If you say so. She pushed him again. Stop it. He continued to laugh for the next few steps until they heard something up ahead. Virginia's eyes widened with some fear, but more curiosity. What was that? Charles listened for a second. Something like soft thunder echoed in the woods ahead of them. That's Nathaniel, he said. But it sounds like thunder, she said, but quieter than thunder. He must be using his sword to split wood. Virginia thought back to when Charles was fighting the giant monster that found them in the woods. Yeah, I remember your sword doing the same thing. It was terrifying. I didn't know what to make of it. It's the metal of Oral Muti. It's not of this world, or Earth. It's from Oral Muti's realm, given to his warriors to fight against the darkness. Tell me more about this Oral Multi? Charles smiled again. Oral Muti. Another big word. Try to sound it out. Repeat after me. Muti. Virginia drew a deep breath and re-spoke exactly what she had heard. Oral Muti. That's it. Well done. Virginia smiled. Finally got one word down, and if I had to guess, an important one too. Charles nodded his head. Oh, yes, a very important one. So who is he exactly? You mentioned him the other night, but tell me more about him. Charles smiled again. You have to wait until... Virginia groaned. Ugh, until we reach the city of Gaal. I know. You know I'm not doing this to annoy you, said Charles warmly. Virginia looked at him through the corner of her eyes with a playful smirk. Yeah, I know. You do? Yeah, you annoy me in too many other ways. Charles smiled and nudged her with his elbow. She smiled and pushed back against his shoulder. The small claps of thunder drew nearer and nearer. In front of them was a fallen red pine. Its roots fanned out at its base, rising 30 feet in the air, forming a massive hole in the ground where they were once buried. Nathaniel, shouted Charles. Over here, Nathaniel shouted back. The other side of the tree. Another small clap of thunder shook the surrounding forest. Virginia and Charles walked around the tree's roots and spotted Nathaniel on the other side. Several branches were lined up beside him. In front of him were 2 branches, one resting across the other. Virginia watched as Nathaniel swung his sword behind his back and drew it high in the air before bringing it down on the branch in front of him, giving it a clean slice. The severed end somersaulted in the air, where he reached out and caught it in mid-flight. He leaned over and placed it on a small stack of logs beside him. He looked up and spotted them rounding the corner. Welcome! He leaned down, pulled the rest of the branch across the other, swung his sword around, and repeated the same act. Virginia watched as the severed end of the branch twirled in the air again, where Nathaniel caught it and stacked it with the rest. Brought some help with you, I see, said Nathaniel. Precisely, said Charles. Actually, Virginia is going to stay and help you for a minute, if that's okay. Of course. Virginia looked at Charles worriedly. Charles looked down at her and smiled warmly. She has some questions to ask you, if that's okay. Oh, most certainly, replied Nathaniel, swinging his blade against the branch. This is the pile I've collected so far. Tristan just took a bundle of kindling back to camp. I'm making enough to supply us for the night. Charles reached down and collected the pile in his arms. About 4 more piles of this, and we should have more than enough. Charles began walking to the end of the tree. Virginia trotted after him. Charles, she whispered, you're going to leave me here? After what I just said earlier? Don't worry, he replied softly. Nathaniel is the strongest of us. He won't let anything hurt you. She looked back at Nathaniel as he swung against the branch, and then at Charles with worried, fearful eyes. You're safe with him, said Charles warmly. I promise. She drew a deep, shaky breath and looked back at Nathaniel. She returned her eyes to Charles and nodded her head. He smiled at her again and continued walking. She exhaled a nervous breath as she watched him round the end of the tree and step out of sight behind its roots. Dark Cry rested on all fours down in the tall ferns of the woods, perched like a lion in tall grass stalking its prey, his green eyes focused intently into the forestry distance. His claws gripped the earth beneath him, and his ears turned this way and that, picking up different sounds in the woods. Beside him rested another wolf, perched, and just as focused into the distant woods. My prince, Dark Cry, began the wolf. "Yes, Spirit Claw," replied Darkrai, refusing to move his eyes. "What is it?" "At the lake," he continued. "How did it feel?" Darkrai looked at him out of the corners of his eyes and stared back. "How did what feel?" Spirit Claw held his tongue for a minute, carefully constructing the following sentence in his mind. "You were trying to reach the other form, weren't you?" Darkrai kept silent, staring fiercely into the distance. "The next form above our current one," continued Spirit Claw. "The next stage of the Rahun. Like our ancestors before us. The few who were able to reach it anyway." Darkrai kept his focus. "What did it feel like, sir?" "I'll let you know once I've actually achieved it," he said bitterly. Darkrai's ears faced forward, as did Spirit Claw's. They stood up as 8 sets of green eyes raced in their direction. Coming to a halt out of the darkness were 8 powerful forest phantoms. They each extended a paw and bowed their heads to Darkrai. "My Prince Darkrai," said one, "we have found them." "Report," said Darkrai. They all raised their heads as the one continued to talk. "They based their camp 2 miles south from where we are now, at the base of the mountain." "Are their numbers still the same?" "Yes, sir. She still follows the 3 warriors. Last we saw her, she was following one of them into the woods." "Soaring Eagle is having them keep a closer eye on her." "Shall we report back to Princess Aniatha, sir?" "No. Return and stalk her from a distance. When she is with only one of them and his guard is down, then attack." "Shall we bring her back alive, sir?" Darkrai raised his snout and looked deeply into the woods. "No. Kill her, and do not return without your mission completed." Virginia turned around and watched Nathaniel strike the branch with his sword. The newly severed end twirled in the air. Like a snake striking its prey, Nathaniel reached out and caught it in mid-flight. She crossed her arms and sheepishly walked back to him. "You're pretty good at that." He stacked the log on a new pile and looked up at her. "Good at splitting wood?" "Well, I mean, you've got a pretty interesting pattern going there. Looks like you've been doing this for a while." Nathaniel smiled and laughed. "Yeah, well, when you travel as much as we have, you develop some familiar patterns." "You say we, meaning you, Tristan and Charles?" Nathaniel walked down the tree branch, chopping off small branches along its stalk. "That's right. Of course, we know him more as Soaring Eagle here." Virginia snapped her fingers. "Right, yeah, I keep forgetting that." "Oh, that's okay. Sometimes we call him Charles by mistake. Depends on how often we hear his Earth name spoken around us." Virginia walked over and began picking up the small branches Nathaniel chopped off. "Thank you," he said. "No worries," she replied. "So how long have you 3 known each other?" Nathaniel paused his chopping momentarily as he calculated back in his mind. "Wow, it's been a while," he said as he resumed chopping branches. "Since I was about 7 or 8 maybe, so about 10 years or so." Virginia dragged the small branches away, piled them on the ground, and returned to collect more. "How old are you?" 17, replied Nathaniel. "And how old is Tristan?" "He's 16. He should be turning 17 not too long from now. If I had to guess, you're about the same age as us." "I'm 17, yes," said Virginia. "I'll be 18 in spring." "Oh, big plans happen for people who turn 18 on Earth, I'm told." Virginia looked around her and recalled all that happened in the past few days. "Not as big as this, that's for sure." "Oh, yeah?" Virginia raised her eyebrows. "Oh, yeah, definitely not." "You don't fight any werewolves on Earth?" Virginia shook her head. No. No, we don't." She paused, picking up branches, and looked at him. "Hey, thank you for that, by the way." Nathaniel paused for a minute and looked at her. "For what?" "For what you and Tristan and Charles did back there. You know, taking on all those wolves and such." Nathaniel smiled at her and continued chopping off the small branches. "Of course. I would have been too scared to do anything like that." He laughed. "Well, you spat in Darkrai's face. I've never even done that before." Virginia smirked, reflecting upon the memory. "Yeah, I guess I did." She watched as he picked up the branch and placed it across the log at the end. "How did you do it?" Nathaniel walked down to where he was originally chopping firewood. "Do what?" "Fight them the way you did." She looked down at his hammer resting against the fallen tree. "I mean, I don't know many people who could pick up that huge mallet of yours, let alone one of those wolves. I mean, they were the size of horses almost, and you picked one up and tossed it around like a club, as if it was nothing. Nathaniel smiled at her. It's the gift that Oral Muti gave to my people. Every one of his people has it, but he gave more of it to my people. And what is that? She asked. What did he give? Nathaniel raised his arms and flexed his biceps. The strength of Oral Muti. Virginia smirked at him. What a ham. And that is what makes you this strong? Correct? That and maintaining it, too. You have to work it out, just like how you have to work out normally. He gives you the gift, but it's on loan. If you want to keep it going, you must continue serving him and his mission. You mentioned your people a second ago. Who are your people? Nathaniel swung his sword through the air, severed the end of the branch, caught it in midair, and handed it out for Virginia to take. That's a long story for sure, but I'll give you the shorter version for now. The rest I'll share later. Virginia took the 3-foot branch from Nathaniel. Sounds good to me. She walked over and placed it down on the ground, forming a new pile, before returning to Nathaniel. I come from a big kingdom to the south called Hazakayim, he said. We were once a powerful people, gifted with the strength of Oral Muti, and close allies with the waters of Lalathea and the kingdom of Earth Stars. So the borders of your nation touch the borders of Earth Stars? Nathaniel nodded his head. Yes, most of it, anyway. Sadly, a long time ago, the kingdom split in half due to a civil war. The western half of the nation fell under the rule of Skalgal Murarets, while the eastern half, my half, remains loyal to Oral Muti. How did your kingdom fall into civil war? Nathaniel chopped off a new piece, caught it in the air, and paused, searching for the right words. Have you heard about what happened regarding the Great Division? I know some of it, yes, but not the whole ordeal, no. He passed the log off to Virginia. During that time, my kingdom and all the kingdoms around us were under the control of a superpower from the northeast of here, a kingdom that had aligned itself with Skalgal Murarets. My kingdom, the waters of Aletheia, and the other nations under its control met in secret to devise a way to throw off this kingdom's rule over us. Nathaniel swung his sword around, severed a new log, and passed it off to Virginia. Having come from Aletheia, I'm sure you already know this. Virginia took the log and stared off into space, a looming guilt bogging her mind. So he does think I'm Rose Cohen. How do I tell him? Go on, please. During that time, the nations in this secret alliance had a plan to rebel against the kingdom from the north. My kingdom was set to fight against them alongside the rest, but... Virginia placed the logs on the pile, turned around and spotted Nathaniel gazing bitterly at the ground. But what? But we betrayed them. He swung his sword down on the branch again. But it wasn't like you betrayed them, though, she said softly. No, but my ancestors did. How did it happen? He passed the new log off to Virginia. The ancient king of my kingdom had 2 wives. One he was already married to, and the other he married the night before the battle was to take place. While in their bedchambers that night, she killed him in his sleep. That's terrible. Yeah, it was. After this, the new queen sent her men to kill the king's other wife, but fortunately, the other queen became aware of her schemes and fled the city that night with her loyal subjects. The city fell into chaos as those loyal to the king's first wife fought against those who were not. Even the army split in half. One half remained loyal to the king's wife, while the rest remained loyal to the new queen. Ever since then, my kingdom has been divided. If it were not for the help of Soaring Eagle's kingdom helping us, we would have fallen a long time ago. So it seems like there is hope for you and your kingdom, right? I mean, with Charles's kingdom helping and all. Nathaniel swung his sword around and chopped off a new piece. One can only hope, Your Highness. Hope is all we have now these days, it seems. Virginia took the new log from Nathaniel. Is there a plan to retake your nation and restore it to what it once was? There is, yes, but if we don't have more help soon, it's only wishful thinking. Virginia placed the logs on the pile. But there's at least a plan, right? A wishful plan, yes. Well, let's hear it. Nathaniel smiled and chopped another end off the branch. The queen that fled the city that night found out a month later that she was pregnant with the king's child, a son, in fact. The other queen had no children and formed a new arrangement with the new king. They had a child that was not of the king's original bloodline. So the good queen's royal bloodline continues then. Nathaniel passed the severed branch off to Virginia. That it does. Virginia stacked the log with the rest. Do I get to meet one of them at this city we're going to? Long before that. He waved his hand, presenting himself. You're looking at one of them now. She stared at him curiously. Wait, You're one of the offspring of this good queen? Indeed, he replied. My siblings and I, of course. Wow, that's so cool. I've never met a prince before. Nathaniel pointed back to camp. You know Soaring Eagle? Her eyes widened as she looked back in the direction of their campsite. Yes, I guess that's true. I've heard others call him a prince. He refuses to tell me any details regarding that. He hasn't told you? Asked Nathaniel. No, replied Virginia, he hasn't. And that's as far as we should go on the subject, echoed a voice from behind. Virginia turned around and saw Tristan rounding the tree's roots. Careful, Nathaniel, said Tristan teasingly. This one is good at getting answers out of people. Oh, yeah? Yes, and Soaring Eagle made it stubbornly clear to me that she is to wait until she arrives at Gaal before she gets any answers regarding him or anything relating. Oh, it wasn't her fault. I told her on my own. Well, she's not getting anything more from us, he said playfully. Are these ready to be carried? Help yourself, said Nathaniel, swinging his sword into the branch. Tristan picked up the pile that Virginia had been working on. Hey, want to help me carry this back to camp? He asked Virginia. Virginia shrugged her shoulders. Sure. Great. Pick up those last 3 and follow me. Virginia looked down and saw the only 3 remaining. How did he... Okay. She picked up the last 3 on the ground and faced Nathaniel. Thank you for sharing. Nathaniel swiped his sword and caught the new twirling log. My pleasure, Your Highness. She turned and followed Tristan around the tree roots while Nathaniel continued to chop more firewood. Virginia sped up to walk beside him. She looked up at the dove that continued to follow them from tree branch to tree branch. What's it like out there? Asked Tristan. Virginia looked at him. Out where? On Earth. What's it like? I've always wanted to visit. Virginia searched the corners of her mind for the best way to reply. Well, it's nice. I mean, I like it. It's where I was born. Do you have trees like these there? Virginia looked up at the red pines. We do, actually, but not where I live. They're more in the northwest of where I live. Oh, really? Yeah. Virginia spotted the dove flying from tree branch to tree branch above them again. But I'll tell you what we don't have. We don't have doves that follow us, or that can heal people by placing their wings on us. I'm sure you do. You just have to wait for them to reveal themselves. He looked up at the dove. That's how I found Uriah. Well, more like how he found me, to be exact. She looked back up with Tristan. What do you mean? He found me in the woods when I was a little boy. I was lost, blind. I was starving and nearly dead, and then I saw him flying in my direction. He saved me. Virginia looked at him. Say what? All right, now I have a bunch of questions. Tristan laughed and looked at her. People usually do. So, she bit her lower lip and tried to find the most appropriate way to ask it. You said you were blind? Technically, yes. A puzzled look crossed Virginia's face. Technically? Well, that's what normally happens when you've had a knife drawn across your eyes. Virginia froze in her tracks. Oh, my. Tristan turned to look at her. What? Someone cut your eyes? Yep, pretty much. How is he so casual with this? I'm so sorry. That must have been terrifying. I wouldn't know. I was just a baby when it happened. Virginia felt her stomach knot up. When you were a baby? Yes. What sick monster would do that to a child? Tristan smiled. Well, that's a bit of a long story, to say the least, but I'm used to telling it. Please, if it's not too much on you. Tristan pointed with his head somewhere past Virginia. There is a kingdom. Up north, far, far from here. The northern woods of Earth Stars? She guessed. No, but just beyond that, the northern kingdom of Earth Stars and this nation's borders touch one another. I'll save the bigger details for Daniel at Gaal, but for a brief backdrop, I'm part of a people called the Waters of Aletheia. Soaring Eagle told you about the Great Division, didn't he? He told me a little, yes. I'm guessing this Daniel that I'm going to see will paint a bigger picture of the event. Tristan smiled. Yeah, he's good at that. Well, during that time, in the land of the waters, there was a city, a great city that my ancestors lived in. During the Great Division, it was pillaged and torched, and the survivors were taken as slaves to the north by our attackers. Virginia's eyes were locked onto Tristan's blindfold as he spoke. Go on. Tristan shifted the wood in his hands. Let's walk and talk if that's okay. My arms are getting tired. They carried on through the woods while Tristan continued to share. There was once a prophet of the waters of Aletheia called Elion. During the Great Division, he went to the north to try to free them. One man against an army? Tristan smiled. He was a very powerful man, skilled with the wing, fire, and metal of Oral Muti. He was also gifted with the eyes and tongue of Oral Muti. Virginia shook her head as if a math problem had rendered her mentally defeated. Yeah, Tristan, I'm sorry, but you totally lost me on, well, most of that actually. Which part? Going to sound stupid, aren't I? Well, let's just start with what you said last. The eyes and tongue of Oral Muti? Virginia stared at him out of the corners of her eyes. Sure. Yes, please. Yes, said Tristan, smiling. They were powerful gifts from Oral Muti. When spoken, the tongue of Oral Muti would break forth in some kind of shield, quaking the ground and shaking all around it. The shield would smash against anything it touched, damaging anything evil. So wait, like an actual shield that the Romans used or something? The Romans? Yeah, oh, crap. My bad. What are Romans? Long story, a people who used to live on Earth a long time ago. Virginia searched for the right way to describe it. You know, like how soldiers carry swords and shields into battle. Oh, that kind of shield. Yeah, was that it? Tristan chuckled. Oh, no, most certainly not. Virginia looked away, hiding her embarrassment. I'm sorry, said Tristan. I didn't mean to embarrass you. She lifted her head again. No, you're okay. So, not a Roman. I mean, not a soldierly shield, then. No, not like that. More like a sphere of some kind. Would it, like, appear in front of you or something? Not exactly. From what I've read, and according to the stories of old, it would come from inside of you, from within your core, and expand out around you, pushing back against anything that drew near. Virginia stared off in front of her with wonder in her eyes. That's cool. Will I get to see that happen? Tristan chuckled. I'm hoping so. She looked at him. You hope so? Yes. That gift hasn't been seen in ages, unfortunately. Eliane was one of the last to have used it. But if the prophecies are true, we will see it again. The prophecies? Yes, there are quite a few, actually, one of which speaks of your return to us. Virginia's face went pale white. Oh, please don't talk about that, please. And the others? Tristan raised his eyebrows. Whoa, which one? There are quite a few. What about the one regarding the tongue and eyes of Oral Muti? She smiled at herself. Hey, I said his name right this time without tripping up. Ah, yes. It was one given by Burning Eagle, after Eliane's passing. Passing? Interrupted Virginia. Well, yeah, replied Tristan, dumbfounded. It was ages ago. No, I mean, did he die while fighting, or what? Tristan shook his head. Nope, I'm going to be a little stubborn with this one like Charles. Daniel will fill you in on the bigger details of all that. What? Tristan, come on. Charles is doing that for reasons he refuses to explain fully. I'm refusing to do what? Came a voice in front of them. Virginia gasped and jumped in her place. Standing in front of her was Charles. Ah, right on time, said Tristan, passing his lumber off to Charles. Hey, exclaimed Charles, catching the timber. What's this? An assembly line, said Tristan cheerfully. Oh, is that right then? He looked at Virginia. Well, might as well pass me yours too. She placed her pieces on the pile in Charles's hands. Now then, said Charles, what are you both talking about? Tristan refuses to tell me what happened to Eliane. Oh, you tattletale, said Tristan playfully. Virginia looked at Tristan, frowned her lips, and glanced back at Charles. Charles, tell him to tell me about how Eliane died. Charles shrugged his shoulders, turned around, and walked back to camp. Ball is in your court, Tristan. Hey, wait, shouted Virginia. What's with you guys and your secrets? She looked around, pleading with the surrounding woods. I mean, seriously, I haven't seen girls keep these many secrets. Tristan laughed. I just want to give my grandfather of many generations back a decent look at his legacy. Daniel will be the best one for that. Virginia turned around and faced Tristan. Your grandfather? Well, quite a ways back. My great-something generations ago grandfather. But yeah, I'm technically one of his blood descendants. Well, that's an interesting new piece of information. Tristan began walking back in Nathaniel's direction. Well, let's go collect our next pile of wood, and we'll talk about it along our way. Several pairs of green eyes watched carefully as Virginia and Tristan began walking back in the direction they came. Attack now, my Prince Darkrai? Asked one of them. "No," said Darkrai, "not yet. Let them get far enough away from Soaring Eagle. When they are separated far enough, then attack." Carefully and quietly, they all began to walk, hiding deep in the thicket of the forest. "Get ready," said Darkrai. Virginia walked beside him. "Okay, you, start talking." Well, one of the prophecies left behind by Burning Eagle was that during the time leading up to and after the arrival of Cohen, the gifts of Oralmuti would return. Specifically, in this case, they would start with the descendants of Eliane. "Huh, so he didn't die in battle, did he?" exclaimed Virginia. "How do you say that?" A smug, teasing look crossed her face, because if it was promised to his descendants, then that means that he would have had to attempt to rescue his pregnant wife who was taken away along with the rest of the captives to the north? That would be correct. Virginia stared off, watching as her irrevocable evidence was flushed away in front of her. "Right, that of course was my next guess." Tristan laughed. "Nice try, though." She groaned in her defeat. "Oh, go on. So the gifts are going to return through Eliane's offspring?" "Yes, specifically that the sons of Eliane would receive the eyes of Oralmuti, while his daughters would receive the tongue of Oralmuti. When word of this prophecy reached the north, the king of that region issued an edict, which said that all the sons of Eliane were to have their sight blinded, and his daughters were to have their tongues removed." Virginia's stomach knotted up again. "I can't. That's beyond deranged. It doesn't get much prettier. Are you sure you're okay if I continue?" Virginia drew a deep breath through her nose, trying to settle her insides. "Please, keep sharing." The forest phantoms all have a few things in common, one of which is the ability to sniff out familiar relations in one's blood. She looked at Tristan with a baffled stare. "They can tell the mother or father of someone just by smelling their blood?" "Correct." She turned her head forward and shivered at the thought of it. "Well, that's unfortunate." "Indeed. If I had to guess, this northern evil king had the wolves find Eliane's descendants one by one." "Yes, but not all of them. You see, this particular prophecy was not unveiled until over 100 years after Eliane's death, and was only made known to the southern woods of Earth stars. Once word began to spread, that was when the king made the edict, but by then, Eliane's descendants already began to grow in number." "Exactly. Some of the women there would be hidden by their neighbors who believed in the prophecy, knowing they were possibly holding the key to their rescue from captivity. Others were not so fortunate." "What do you mean?" "The king knew that it was difficult and frustrating to hunt these mothers down individually. Rather, he decided to find a way for them to hand over their offspring willingly." A familiar knot began to reform in Virginia's gut. "Please, don't tell me they handed over their own children." Tristan turned his face toward hers. "That's exactly what they did." Virginia felt like an invisible force gripped her core. "How?" Tristan faced forward again, by promising them a better way of life than the one they were living. Plenty of food for them alone to eat, rather than feeding two. A shelter, a better way of life. But in the end, their reward for denying their offspring only sank them deeper into a new kind of slavery. Her eyes began to water as her next question finally surfaced. "Did your mother give you up?" Tristan did not answer for a long second. Finally, he replied, "Yes, but my story is far better than the rest." "I can't see how." "Because the children who were found or offered up were not only chosen to have their eyes and tongues removed, they were also thrown into the fires of Tophet." Her reddening eyes began to widen with horror. "What?" Tristan stopped walking and turned to face Virginia. He removed his bow and quiver from his back. "Yes. When a child of the prophecy is discovered, he or she is first branded." He handed his bow, quiver, and satchel to Virginia. She took them carefully and watched as he unbuckled his sword strap. "Branded?" she asked. "Branded how?" Tristan handed his sword off to Virginia, untied the cloak around his neck, and let it fall to the ground. "Like this," he said. He turned around and pulled the shirt collar down over his right shoulder, revealing his back to Virginia. On his shoulder blade was a burn mark of an ancient letter. Virginia hovered her index finger over it, tracing out a foreign symbol. "What is that? Is it the brand of the king?" Tristan chuckled. "No, the royal family wouldn't dream of putting their sacred name on one of us. It's a letter in the language of the north, the first letter of Eliane's name." He pulled his shoulder back inside his sleeve, turned around and fastened the drawstrings on the front of his shirt. After they are branded, the women have their children returned to them, but a seed would be planted in their hearts, an incentive to return, if you will. An incentive? How so? They would entice them with the better way of life I mentioned earlier. Bring them back to us to have their eyes and tongues removed, and we will give you a better way of life that will support you and your branded children. Some of the mothers would bring back their children to have their sons' eyes cut through and their daughters' tongues removed. These men would return the blind, mute children to their mothers, now saying, "You should bring them back and let us commit the final act so that they don't spend their lives wandering maimed in this dark world." Tristan bent down and picked up his cloak. So the women would steadily bring their children back to be given to the priest of the kingdom and burned alive, all in hopes of a better life after the deed was finished. Virginia held on to his weapons as if they were children in her arms. "How did you escape?" He smiled. "By my mother." "Your mother? But she gave you up." "Yes, and she killed one of the city's priests to get me back before I was placed in the fire." Her eyes widened. "What?" "Yes, she had me given over to have my eyes blinded, but she was grieved by what she had done. So she snatched me out of the priest's hands before he could kill me, and then raced off back into the city. I'll bet the city was turned over while they looked for her." "From what I was told, yes, it was, but she was able to escape with me and my sister into the northern kingdom of Earth Stars." "You have a sister?" "I do." The sudden swelling excitement allowed her to ask the next question more bravely. Did she have... Tristan shook his head. "No. I was told that she did not have her tongue removed, but she was branded like me. She would have been next after me to have her tongue removed, but as my mother held her, and after hearing my crying, she dashed off with both of us and escaped the city." "You said you were told she didn't have her tongue removed. What do you mean? Don't you see her?" Tristan shook his head. "Nope. While my mother was escaping the city, she was wounded by the soldiers' arrows." "Wait, she hiked across an entire country and into another country with arrow wounds?" "Oh no, she had help escaping. Do you want me to share those details now?" Virginia shook her head. "No. Please tell me that part later, but continue about your sister." "Well, since we were the first to have escaped from that city who were descendants of Eliane, the king of the northern woods of Earth Stars, the chief of the tribe of Laughing Horse, brought my sister and me to Gaal. There they decided that I should continue to live here in Aletheia while she was taken to live on Earth. With the number of descendants of Eliane dwindling, they felt it best to keep both the son and daughter of the prophecy safe and protected until the time would come." She looked at him with a hopeful eye. "But after seeing you and what you're able to do, it looks like part of that has come true." He smiled and put his fist on his hips. "Yes, indeed." Virginia held his weapons in one arm, allowing her other to hold up 3 fingers. Okay. How many fingers?" "3. Virginia's eyes widened. "This is amazing. You're blind and blindfolded, yet you can see." She wrapped her arm around his weapons again. "I hope you don't think me inappropriate, but why the blindfold, if you're blind?" Tristan touched the front of his blindfold, tracing his fingers over the emblems and letters embroidered on it. "It was given to me by the tribe of Laughing Horse. After I received the eyes of Oral Muti, my eyes began to shine. Even when I would close them, the light would shine through the seams of my lids. It terrified them. So they asked if I could cover them. I agreed, and for that purpose I keep it on. I can still see without it. Plus, if I'm fighting a really, really strong bad guy, I take it off to scare the devil." Virginia's eyes grew with wonder. "I want to see those eyes." "When did it happen? When did you get the eyes of Oral Muti?" A long story made short, I was a little boy, 5 or 6 years old, somewhere in there. I was in a world of darkness, scared, confused, and bitter. The tribe of Laughing Horse raised me, instilling in me the prophecies of old, and that one day I would become a powerful warrior. Well, after years of darkness, I decided I had enough, so I ran away." "You were 5 years old, blind, and chose to run away?" "Yeah, I figured how much worse could my life get, really?" But it did get worse. After a few days of wandering with no food or water, I was near death. At that moment, I cried out to Oral Muti for help, begging for the prophecy to be true. When I heard the evening crickets chirping, I saw something for the first time. Virginia held the items in her arms tighter. "What was it?" Tristan pointed his index finger to the treetops. "Uriah, the dove." "You saw him?" "Yes, he was the first thing I ever saw in my life. When he found me, I was lying on the ground, nearly passed out. He landed in front of my face, placed his feathers over my eyes, and then suddenly, I could see everything around me. But my sight is limited." "Limited? How so?" The eyes of Oromouti and the dove are of the same gift and spirit. Like a lock and key, they go together. I can only see what the dove allows me to see. Like you, I can see for miles around me, or I can only see what's a few feet ahead of me. Like how a torch illuminates things in the dark, it just depends on what he wants to reveal to me. When I was little, he would reveal a lot less of my surroundings, but as I grew, he allowed me to see everything, so long as I do not leave him. So long as you don't leave him? Yes, wherever he flies, I follow. Otherwise, I lose my sight, or at least it becomes severely limited. If I want the fullness of that gift, I need to be with the dove of Oromouti. Throughout the years, we've formed a bond where my mind has become so much like his. Because of this, our missions are so united, I always seem to go wherever he goes, automatically, like we're one. However, if I'm about to do something he does not like, he squawks at me and eventually stops flying with me, allowing me to walk further into the darkness if I wish. She looked up at Uriah, nestled in the tree branches. So in a way, he's like a torch that reveals everything or limits everything while enhancing your gift. Tristan smiled and looked down at Virginia, precisely. Without notice, Tristan reached out and grabbed the handle of his sword in Virginia's arms. Virginia, I need you to do me a favor. She looked at him with concern and confusion. What? Fall to the ground. What? Tristan drew his sword from its sheath, swatted his arm against Virginia, and knocked her off her feet. She screamed, turned over, and fell on her back. Looking above, she saw a large, dark creature soaring over her in midair. Tristan stepped to the side and swiped his shining blade fiercely through the air. Black blood splashed overhead, followed by the clapping of thunder and the whimpering barks of a dog. Virginia turned her head, watching as a massive wolf landed beside her and stared with lifeless eyes while pools of black blood pumped out of the wound in its neck. Virginia screamed, dropped Tristan's items, and scrambled to her hands and knees. It was then she heard the other barks. She raised her head and looked through her tousled hair at 7 wolves charging in their direction. A hand reached down and pulled her up to her feet. "Now I need you to stand," said Tristan. He pulled her behind him. Quick as lightning, a wolf in the lead leaped in the air for them. Tristan swung his arm behind him, sweeping Virginia in its current. Like 2 dancers in unison, he stepped back with her and cut his sword through the air, slicing the neck of the beast as it soared past them. Another appeared after it. It raced across the ground, opening its jaws wide, aiming to catch them both in its passing wake. Tristan swung his arm around Virginia's back and pushed her forward. Sliding with her, he maneuvered them out of the beast's path before barely missing its teeth. Swift and agile, Tristan swung his sword up, slicing through the creature's throat. A small geyser of blood followed his blade as it thundered and raked through the monster's fur. The remaining 5 wolves halted in their tracks, staring fearfully at Tristan. Tristan held his sword out and stood guard. Virginia placed her back against his and shivered with fear as the wolves slowly broke off and began to circle them.
This is the end of Chapter 15. Tune in next Thursday for Chapter 16. If you'd like to listen to the next chapter ad-free ahead of everyone else, then subscribe to Early Access and tune in on Sunday. If you like what you heard, please like and subscribe and share with your friends and family. It really helps the show. We're available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and all major podcasting platforms. What Shines with the Dawn was written and created by C. Taylor Eason. Copyright Christian Taylor Eason, 2024.